Okay, this video is a video lecture for choosing a digital repository. Okay, so what do we call it? That's been a theme in this course where we're sometimes often using digital library as a stand-in for a bunch of other names. And for the purpose of the course, we've been sort of using them interchangeably, but they all do mean something a little bit different depending on the user, depending on the stakeholders or the discipline or environment in which they're being used. So we have a few different names here. We have Digital Asset Management System. Sometimes it's just called a DAMS or just 3 letters, DAM. Sort of an awkward long name, but it's something I'm very used to hearing. Institutional Repository or IR. Repository software, a little bit more generic and just kind of agnostic sounding. Content management system, a little less of a digital library, more of like something that you would use as a web, to keep your website, but still sometimes you might see that used in the digital library literature. Again, just digital libraries we've been talking about. Data repository, perhaps something you might think of like it being in a scholarly institute or like NASA or some kind of research facility. They would use a data repository. Electronic record system might be something that you would see perhaps in an archive or maybe in a records management facility, or more in the private sector where, like, say, banks and so on and so forth might be using a lot of the same principles we've learned in this class, but more for actual like business records. So electronic record system, electronic management record system, EMRS. If you take the records management course or electronic records, that's the sort of realm that you'll talk about there. So who are our audience? Who are your audience or users? Well, there's the general public. So when you're considering what kind of repository software do I want for my digital library, you need to think of your users. So there's a general public. There's institutional, so where do you work, or what is sort of the mission of your institute? So I work at the University at Albany, so that would be the institutional, that would be our audience. But because I'm also in an archives, we also work with the general public. We work with all sorts of people in the all around the world. But institutional could be corporation. You could, for example, work at a say the Baseball Hall of Fame. It would be like a private archive, but you'd have a very specific user base there. You can always throw the general public in. They're not always, but typically, especially if you're sort of open on the web, you can always throw the general public because they're just via Google are going to find you. You could be a government institution. Again, you could be like the Library of Congress, very similar to work that I do, but you could be NASA, the FBI. I mean, there's all sorts of institutions where sort of education is not necessarily their mission, nonprofits, and then again, museums, collecting archives, libraries. There's all sorts of libraries, anything from K through 12, public, private. There's just all sorts of research or a lab, as I mentioned, like NASA, but you could also be at a private corporation again that has a reason to have their research in some kind of digital library. Learning objects, this would be like educators. Learning objects is just sort of a fancy term for like instructional media that you might put up on a digital library. And then a data repository. Again, data repository sort of beyond the scope of this class. I mean, a lot of the principles you learn in this can be applied to a data repository, but I find data repositories not only require a lot of skills of a information science major, but also typically require some disciplinary knowledge. If it's a plant library, digital library, or like ornithology, so on and so forth, typically there's more skills needed beyond what we would typically learn in this class, disciplinary knowledge. So what kind of sort of would you say users or institutions? We have scholars or places of academic research, so a digital library to publish an essay or digital dissertation, share primary source collections, or collaborate with others in the creation of digital scholarship. We have museums, again, there to educate, but perhaps more outward facing than, say, a academic institution. They might use a digital library to share collections, build online exhibits with objects you cannot display in the museum, for example. Maybe they're valuable or fragile, or just things that don't work really well anymore for physical display. You can invite your visitors to tag or mark items as favorites, or even contribute to content. Typically, any contribution you make to that content may not be permanent, or if it is, it's sort of kept separate from what might be the authorized content that's created by librarians or curators. And you can do other things as add-ons to your digital library. You can blog or publish about museum news and podcasts. What we think of librarians and how they would use a digital library would be a publishing tool to complement your online catalog. So in this case, we have Minerva and all of our print publications and books that we own, but we would use the digital library to complement that. We might do exhibits. This might be in concert with the Special Collections Department, where they have original content that they own the copyright to, that they can digitize and put up in a digital library. Or it may be licensed content. We haven't really talked about that in this class, but there are digital libraries where the librarian is purchasing, via library funds, is purchasing material from vendors, and then that license that they have, it may be in perpetuity, but typically it's a license where you have to renew it every year, or maybe it's a 5-year license. Those are all materials that would go in a digital library. It's stuff we haven't talked about too much in this course because I tend to make certain assumptions, although again, as you can see, the sort of landscape of digital libraries is huge and the sky is the limit. But this is one aspect. Our library does have a digital library that usually it's provided by the vendor itself, so they don't really sell you, this is kind of a big sidebar here, but they don't really sell you the individual content. So for example, if you bought like an e-book collection, so it's a digital library, there's electronic books in there, they don't typically send you the books in the same way they would a print collection, where you actually have the book in your hand, or in this case, if it was a digital library, where they're actually sending you individual PDFs or TIFF files or whatever. Typically, they provide it via their own digital library platform, and then you really just, all you do is you're just licensing the material. But there are cases where you do actually get the materials themselves, and then it's up to you what kind of software or platform you want to put them in. Also, librarians are engaged in doing open access research, publications, and data, so they might take the research from the various departments and host that through software of the library, a institutional repository, and or data. And even librarians themselves often publish and make available their own research in